Spoiler warning. Spoilers for Deltarune Chapters 3. Let's be real, this video took way too long to make. I started this as soon as Deltarune came out. So yes, spoiler warning for all of Deltarune, but I'm sure it's been long enough that that doesn't matter. Let's just start the video. What a rude awakening this was. Yeah, chapters 3 and 4 have completely shook up everything we thought about Deltarune, whatever. If you're here, you know that. But I don't want to just sit around and say, OMG guys, everything's different now. We were all wrong, we have to start from scratch again. I don't know why that was British. And I conveniently have a list of everything we thought was significant in the past. So I can mash that all into the soup of new info and just kind of talk about what might be important. I'm not really in the business of reaching sound conclusions here, but theorizing on your own is the fun part anyway.
It's now time for your house, Hurry!
Okay. We have to start with this. Whatever old knight theory you subscribed to was thrown out the window, but I can't really say any of the main knight truthers lost, to be honest. Yes, the Roaring Knight is this, and not really any distinct character, but basically all the evidence for the major knight candidates was true. It's just that the ultimate conclusion of the evidence, meaning that they were the knight, wasn't. For example, I was just rocking with the idea of Chris being the knight. I felt like the question of who is the Roaring Knight was not this big overarching mystery that we'd be debating for the entire game. And I thought that having Chris be a direct antagonistic force to the player would be fun. And well, that all happened, didn't it? The knight was not an endgame mystery, and Chris is working against us. And the case is similar with other main candidates like Alvin, who did dig up Gerson's hammer and was seemingly aware that it probably revived Gerson in the Dark World, but that's more relevant to Chapter 4. Basically, the complete opposite of this is that all the things we already knew about Chapter 3 that we thought would be important weren't. Toriel was snoozing it up the whole time, only there to be rescued, and Undyne showed up at the last possible second just to get kidnapped immediately. We asked for some girl power, but it looks like we got stuck with a couple of Princess Peaches, am I right? God, that joke sucked. And Mike was basically nothing. Turns out that Spamton's references to Mike were him just referencing Tana, who's always talking to this concept of a mic. Even Chapter 3's Dark World itself was so specifically TV themed that any references to the rest of the Dreamer family and house were usually insignificant. Nearly all Dreamer lore reveals were exclusively through Tana's epic divorce drama, and even those were more limited than we thought. Let's balance out that impromptu pity party with an exciting lightning round of things we already assumed but are now more strongly confirmed. This might be Susie's room, showing that she is in some bad living conditions. We don't really know for certain if it's her room, but it makes sense if it was with the epic dinosaur poster in the corner. Undyne uses her spears from Undertale, meaning that Undertale characters are likely going to be getting their Undertale branded magic whenever they're in a Deltarune brand Dark World. However, their designs and colors are different, so that doesn't mean that Undertale itself is a Dark World or anything. At the same time, Gaster's famous literary achievement, Entry 17, we now know is undeniably talking about Dark Worlds. And is that really it? Whew, boy, okay. Guess it's time for me to start listing all the confusing details we can't cleanly file away. First and foremost is this opening area. Bro, it's the same as the one for the start of the game. Best of all, we got a pseudo-explanation of what this actually is. This shutta suggests that the weird area with the wobbly-doos and spooky eyes and the piles of nondescript dust might just be the raw form of a Dark World that has no other strong theme to it. Which kinda just means that the start of the Closet Dark World is less meaningful and unique. But that doesn't mean that the spooky stuff in these raw Dark Worlds doesn't have significance. These might be connected to the origins of Dark Worlds as a whole, and for all we know, this might even be a preview of how the Dark World in the Shelter looks. Regardless, it's good to know that simple puzzles are a core foundation of Dark Worlds. Third and backmost, eggs. The egg room in this chapter has a lot of interesting stuff, but the main point I want to focus on here is that these Rudens, the 7 flying aces, were originally black and white, but Chris colored them all, and that's been heavily compared by people to the Goners and Gaster followers from Undertale, who are copies of otherwise normal Undertale NPCs, but grayscale. Though it's also important to note that there's only 6 aces. Maybe that's just a joke about how Chris can't count, but hey, neither can I, so let's not be too hasty here to discredit the importance of this. Second and middlemost, when our controller swapping gig is up, and Susie asks, "Why'd you make me do that?" Is that really my Susie voice? Ralsei, with his little pathetic eyes, looks at us as if to say, "Yo, you aren't controlling her too, are you?" Of course, we can't say for certain that's what he's actually thinking here, but it is more possible evidence that Ralsei knows about the player, which is something I honestly thought was already confirmed, but it never actually is, so hey, more potential evidence of that. Although this whole controller switching escapade also leads to the other epic Ralsei moment TM, where he learns about being player 1. And then after each section in the back rooms, we see him get more and more engrossed in the idea of being his own person and doing his own things, progressively breaking out of his role as a simple follower. This feels like a way to slowly set up Ralsei breaking away from the prophecy, but weirdly, I didn't really see it be directly followed up on in Chapter 4, at least not in any obvious way. I suppose you could just consider this step 2 of Ralsei learning to be more Ralsei-like, as was set up in Chapter 2. But I don't know, the whole being player 1 thing felt a little more odd to me than the rest of that whole arc so far. Speaking of odd, Chapter 3 had a lot of direct ties to both Card Kingdom and Cyberworld all over. Ram even talks about how Chris and that girl, who is probably Noelle, or I guess it could be Des too, huh? Chris and Des might have been besties, we don't really know at this point, but let's just assume it's Noelle, that's simpler, and set ourselves up for when the twist reveal is that Chris was instead very close with Des. But Ram says they would play make-believe in Chris's living room with the computer lab laptop queen and the King of Spades card king. I really wasn't expecting each Dark World to be this intertwined, but this at least explains why King and Queen know each other and why Spamton and Tenna knew each other. On that note, this interaction just straight up confirms to us that the secret bosses are still alive as the items in our inventory. Whether you beat Spamton passively or with violence, he'll still be there to hang out. However, this interaction doesn't happen if you beat Spamton via the weird route, confirming that even though we still get the puppet strings, we did just straight up kill him. Something as equally, probably not important, but mostly just interesting, is that Tenna's flashback of the family falling apart has everyone leave in a deliberate order. Des, Carol, Asgore, Noelle, Rudy, Asriel, Chris, Ventoriel. If we're assuming this accurately reflects how it went in real life, then Des's disappearance was the catalyst of everything falling apart, though we kind of already figured that. It clearly hit Carol the hardest, since she left immediately afterwards, and Asriel left for college after the divorce and all the fallout between the families happened, which is not a great mind space to shackle yourself off to college with. On the topic of Des, though, if you gamble in just the right way to reference the namesake of December holiday, you get access to this, room? Everyone's favorite, obviously significant but impossible to interpret room. We've got nonsensical floor patterns that don't actually restrict you. Constant ambient music that's directly linked to Des Holiday. And a gumball machine that spits out what I can only assume to be a reference to the shadow crystals, but is obviously way too cryptic to be sure. Though, come on, this is probably just a shadow crystal. A lot of early discussion I saw about this said it was a guitar pick because it's a triangle in a Des-related room, I guess, which at that point you've got just as much evidence that this is a new Doritos flavor. I think the fact that holding it makes our hand disappear is a strong enough link to it being a shadow crystal. Besides, if it was a guitar pick, what would that even mean? Oh my god, the Des room has something to do with a guitar in it! Guys, I'm starting to think that guitars might be related to Des in some way. Though, to be fair, linking Des with the shadow crystals is equally as unhelpful nowadays with the whole thing going on, so hey, maybe this room just means Jack nor Jill, and we can just leave it at that. I got this haunted version of Zelda 1 at a garage sale. As I played it, it read out my full name and address. Thinking this was just a glitch, I kept playing. For the most part, the sword route, lame name by the way, functions as a more obvious secret to clue players into the whole Snowgrave thing in Chapter 2, because you were not likely to find that on your own otherwise. Looking at it like that, there's a couple events in this tutorial that haven't happened yet. Namely killing Susie and Rousey, although that's to unlock the back alley in Chapter 2 that we instead unlocked by killing Birdley, so maybe that's already happened, just in a different way. But more importantly, accessing the shelter early, leading people to think that the weird route may end the whole game prematurely. Which I think would be neat, but is pretty unlikely with Deltarune's current release structure. I don't think Toby Fox would want to add a shortcut to the one ending of the game, or reveal that there's actually multiple endings before releasing the intended main ending. Hey, why's the Shadow Mantle in this dark world? Not even Sham knows how we got it. I don't think it was physically in Chris's house. We get it from going deep into a representation of the hometown shelter within a hidden, covered-up version of an 8-bit video game that's in a dark world. The levels of abstraction here are too great to really have any idea where the mantle comes from. But if we were to guess anything at all, maybe the mantle was somehow in the shelter, and this game within a dark world was somehow able to connect to the real shelter. On that same note, we're shown that the layers of abstraction between the dark world and the 8-bit minigames don't matter. 8-bit Chris can go party it up, giving us some Chris content, whatever their chip name is. I'm not looking it up. And Chris can enter the game in real life. This could potentially represent how fiction can still impact the real world, and how real life can, in turn, impact fiction, which is relevant, obviously, to how someone like Susie sees the dark world as real, and how they've improved her life in the light world. But it even represents our relationship with Deltarune by oh boy, that's some, like, we're getting the actual literary analysis there. That is not my comfort zone. But for all you symbolism lovers in the audience, anyway, the mantle minigame itself seems to represent Undertale, specifically in relation to Deltarune. Ram says the original game gave you freedom and choice, while Tana's version is just a linear journey where your choices don't matter. Though, come on Ram, the mantle game doesn't have much choice either, we just get to kill things. However, that's exactly where the parallel lies. Undertale was a game where you had the choice to spare or kill, while Deltarune is a much more linear game built off the bones of Undertale. The mantle games... God, I feel like a Nintendo Direct presentation saying that. Be sure to pick up the Mantle video game for the Toby Fox's Deltarune line of gaming systems on October 3rd. Anyway, the Mantle game's enemies are even direct parallels to major Undertale characters, except for this cat, which I guess could be Mad Mew Mew, but that'd be weird considering there isn't a skeleton in sight. Come on, Tobias, you put in a singing cat for a console-exclusive Undertale character, but you couldn't even add the most common type of video game enemy in history to represent the most popular Undertale characters? And that better not be lore significant, young man. Really, the only thing I have left to talk about with Chapter 3 specifically is the secret boss this sword route leads us to, and the fact that Chapter 3 didn't really have a secret boss in the way we expected. It just had that secret sauce tossed haphazardly across half this whole chapter. Tenet acts like a secret boss because he's Spamton too. Graham talks about freedom and has the general disposition of the sad, pathetic men we've come to expect for the secret boss position. The Shadow Mantle is an actual secret boss fight. The Knight gives you the Shadow Crystal, and Mike is the one with the freedom motif. It's such an intense shattering of what we expect that I wouldn't even consider secret bosses a pattern anymore if it weren't for the fact that Chapter 4's boss repairs that pattern perfectly. Let's make like a Chapter 4 section of a Kazoo Cat video on Deltarune's new chapters, and start with one of the few old theories that somehow wasn't completely destroyed. Oberon Smog is real. Can you believe it, guys? Oberon Smog, just a cope away. Okay, it isn't really Oberon Smog. If you don't know, or never knew, or never cared to know, Oberon Smog is, well, kind of a whole package of theory ideas by JaruJaruJ. The main crux of his theory was confirmed. Monsters can be revived if an object covered in their dust is brought to a dark world, with it even specifically being Gerson's hammer reviving Gerson. All major swings his theory took. The parts of Oberon Smog that weren't right were that his name would be Oberon Smog, nor is he the knight, which was kind of the important part. And I will say the subsequent implications of Ralsei being Azrael's dust is still uncertain, but to be honest, I'm just happy for Charu because he was the one person thinking crazy enough to get basically anything close to correct, and I think he's earned the win after surviving people clowning on him for so long just because his theories are actually theories and not just obvious implications. Supermarkets on November 1st. Don't you worry, this is a quick in and out trip. For starters, if you had any doubt that we, the player, are the soul and Chris is an entirely separate entity opposed to us, you aren't allowed to anymore. Of course, free from our non-binary shackles, we learn a lot about Chris, Asgore, Noelle, Susie, Carol, whatever. But it'll be a lot better to save all of that for later when I can spend dedicated time talking about each character individually. All I'll say is we finally get to see concrete evidence of a Miss December actually existing, and she's basically the exact he was a skater boy type of girl we were expecting. Similarly, Carol is that exact Mike Wazowski. Yeah. Anyway, the important part of her appearance here is that she very subtly shows us that she's aware of the player being in control of Chris. Outside of character specifics, one of the most interesting details here to point out is Susie's reference to a severed hand, which is suspicious only because of the strange number of references to Chris not being able to see their own hand. Yet again, the gachapon room is only important because of it doubling up on something shown elsewhere. Of course, there's nothing that suggests that Blood Crushers, which is where the severed hand comes from, is at all related to the prophecy, but it's still a weird pattern. Also Among Us is canon to Deltarune, but what's really sus is that in Castletown there was always this Rudin who would tell us that the town is named Player Name Town, which is the only reference to the player's name in the whole game. So that already made this guy weird, but now it's blue. I wouldn't think anything of this, but they specifically call this out, saying their color must have faded. Literally the only thing I could think of as any possible explanation here is how there's only 6 of the 7 flying aces in Chapter 3's Egg Room, so maybe this is the 7th. It was originally green, so if it's fading back to its original black and white, that could be why it's now a deeper blue, which I guess makes sense. I don't know what that would really mean in the grand scheme of things, outside of just showing that one of Chris's counterfeit ace cards was moved into the unused classroom with everything else at some point. And now, much like a Susie Dark World, let's talk about all this prophecy malarkey in no particular order. In fact, let's start with the end. This whole chapter builds up the idea that Ralsei knows how the prophecy ends and has been trying desperately to stop us from figuring it out. That is, until the rambunctious Susie goes and learns it herself, and confirms that it's clearly uncomfortable enough for her to shatter it on sight. And obviously the big looming question is, what is it? I personally have been ping-ponging quite a bit on this. One of my first thoughts was just that the Castletown Dark Fountain will be sealed and Darkners will stop existing entirely. And it does seem to line up quite well with how Ralsei's been acting with his whole "don't care about us Darkners" thing recently, as well as the general theme of letting go that's been building up so far. Like, God, it's such a good conclusion story-wise, and yet I'm hesitant to commit to that option because Susie doesn't say we wouldn't do that. It's specifically we wouldn't let that happen. Every time she talks about it, she says that it won't happen, which to me sounds not like something the heroes have to actively do, like sealing a dark fountain, but instead something that will just happen to them. The unfortunate obvious answer is just that someone dies, Whatever it is, though, Susie's reaction is just interesting. Maybe it's because she's being hit with the fact that the prophecy is an unavoidable truth, but her normal response to things like this has just been anger, not a panic punch into laugh it off true combo. Of course, as everybody knows, the downside of that combo is that it draws blood. But that's actually a pretty good information confirmation, because this is something that's always seemed unclear. In Undertale, monsters were made of magic instead of organic material, so instead of bleeding, they'd turn to dust. But in Deltarune's first couple chapters, we had mentions of monsters bleeding and suggestions they couldn't do magic, and yet people doubted that because of this one little guy in a window who was the only counter evidence. That is, until Chapter 4 gave us definitive confirmation that monster dust is a thing, and then also Susie bleeding on screen. So, duh, monsters bleed and turn to dust. It was obvious all along. Though this might not actually be a confusing contradiction anyway, because dust could easily just be cremation or something. Regardless, it looks like we just have to accept that monsters in Deltarune have no magic and yes, blood. And now for a big detour because of Old Man Gerson. During the fight against the Hammer of Justice, he gives us a summary of Lord of the Hammer, a book series based on the prophecy, and yeah, you get it, the summaries tell us about the prophecy. Let's go through each one. Chapter 1, The March of the Dark King. The heroes defeat the king and stop the dragon. The king is obviously king, and Gerson later says that Susie reminds him of the dragon, so I guess stopping the dragon parallels us getting Susie to stop smashing bones. Chapter 2, The City of the Shining. The heroes do battle in chariots to save the queen. And already, it gets interesting. I know Lord of the Hammer is just supposed to be based on the prophecy and not like directly quoting it, but this is a really weird summary of what we did, right? Yeah, the chariots are presumably the coasters we fight Birdly in, and the queen is presumably queen, but save? We didn't save her at all. Unless the queen is Noelle, but why summarize the chapter with the coaster fight? And that is not a significant part of what we did. Unless that's supposed to reference the Spamton Neo fight, but that's optional. Why would that be in the prophecy? Well, Chapter 3, The Isles of the Northern Light. The heroes travel among the islands and catch a glimpse of a lost land. So this seems to be about the sword route specifically. The chapter is even titled The Isles of Northern Light, where in the sword route we see the text, "Go to Northern Light," in reference to going up to the Ice Palace. I'm also not quite sure what the lost land would be other than the Ice Palace. This continues even more with Chapter 4, The Trials of the Holy Hammer. A great smith gives the heroes a terrible weapon. This is just about Gerson, right? And that's an issue because the weapon from Gerson is entirely optional in the normal course of the game. If that's part of the prophecy, then what do? I guess we could just excuse that as something that was changed when adapting the prophecy into Lord of the Hammer, but it's also interesting that the book is named Lord of the Hammer in the first place, presumably because of this part of the story, meaning this must be an incredibly significant moment, or, just because Gerson likes hammers. Chapter 5, The Field of Pink and Gold. The vast garden is charred in an inferno of jealousy. Now this is in the future, so we can't know if this pattern of each chapter summary being more and more about optional content is continuing here or not, but the chapter title references pink and gold, which are significant to Spamton, and this pair of floating eyes with a smile and sometimes a cat body, known as just Friend. Both of these guys show up briefly in the normal course of the game, but are much more significant in the optional content, potentially keeping up that pattern. Chapter 6 exists in Lord of the Hammer, but we hear nothing about it, and Chapter 7 was never written. It could still exist in the prophecy technically, but the fact that it hasn't been written is obviously important to note. So here's the thing. These clearly aren't just about the main events of the game. I'm not sure what exactly they're implying, but Chapter 3 and 4 are both steps that only happen if you're going for the Shadow Crystals. Maybe these events aren't in the actual prophecy, but are all exclusive to Gerson's reinterpretation, specifically because they're optional alternative paths. Forging your own way and giving yourself freedom is what Gerson's all about, so that'd mean his version of the prophecy is telling us how to get freedom through the shadow crystals, and I think that makes sense. No clue if that's actually important, but it's a thing. Epic pivot moment. The things that chase us in the dark a couple of times are Titan spawns, which is weird because the Titan doesn't exist yet. I honestly have no conclusion to this detail. I'm mainly just bringing it up for you to ponder on your lonesome. Yeah, the video essay is asking you to flex your brain muscles. I know that defeats the purpose, but I've done enough work here. You gotta pick up the slack eventually. One of the biggest revelations near the end of the chapter, at least to me, was that Ralsei is not Mr. Pro-Prophecy. He's actually been attempting to defy the prophecy since the very beginning by getting us to spare everyone we could and telling us that our choices matter. But so far, nothing has changed the major course of events. And this is something he tells us no matter which path we take, which, I mean, obviously we could change some things, but I guess we've just been working around the outskirts of the prophecy in the wiggle room it gives us, not changing the actual main prophesized events yet, or at least not the ones Ralsei's aware of. Though I suspect all our choices will change something eventually. But I should mention two key pieces of the prophecy that are often brought up as potential evidence that we have already changed the intended path. The Queen's Chariot cannot be stopped, and Lord of the Screens cleaved red by blade. The Queen's Chariot has been used as proof that the Weird Route has broken the prophecy already, because people think it's specifically referring to this moment, which doesn't happen in the Weird Route. Personally, I doubt that this panel is important enough for that because, one, this feels purely like a joke panel, so it'd be weird for it to have such major implications, and two, if this was truly about that moment, the implication would be that her chariot cannot be stopped because it runs over all the traffic, but you can avoid doing that, meaning this prophecy would be wrong sometimes anyway, and that's not even counting that it very much was stopped. With that being said, I'm not sure what this would be in reference to otherwise, outside of just being a general statement about Queen's reckless driving habits, but I can't fully say that it isn't evidence of the Weird Route breaking from the prophecy. It just doesn't convince me. On the other hand, the Lord of the Screens prophecy is one I haven't seen talked about as commonly, but the idea here is that the image specifically shows a TV being cut in half, whereas when Tenno was cleaved, it was 2 slashes to his arms. The implication then would be that Tenno was destined to fully die, and the fact that he survives in the All Recruits path is proof of us breaking the prophecy there. And, well, to be honest, I think the idea that pacifism will subvert the prophecy is sound, plus analyzing the exact details of the prophecy images is something everyone does with basically all the other panels of the prophecy, so I can't say it's just symbolizing Tenno as a TV, you're reading too much into it, lest I be hypocritical. But I don't know. A main boss being either alive or dead, depending on your actions, is clearly a big deal, but nothing about this prophecy guarantees he was supposed to die. I can't see this being the key piece of evidence to prove that we're already subverting the prophecy, because everything else already is. This one gets its own whole section because it's become a pretty common yet incredibly complicated debate, although the idea itself is really straightforward. Is Susie really the second hero of the prophecy? Yeah, it's kind of just about Susie. Since the moment Ralsei described the heroes as a human, a monster, and a prince of the dark, Susie's position in the prophecy has been suspicious. There's only one human, and, well, there's 2 possible princes of the dark, but let's just agree Lancer is probably not a hero of the prophecy. However, a monster could really be anyone. That's the whole thingy of their religion, right? Anyone could be one of the heroes. However, this idea really solidified with these 2 panels of the prophecy that, well, since this is quite a balanced debate, let's break this up into supporting and counter evidence, starting with everything that makes us think Susie isn't the second hero. The main reason people even got this idea rolling in the first place is because while Suzy assumes both of these panels are about her, and the order we see them in also suggests that they're related to each other, they clearly aren't. We saw the third hero first, so obviously the order is already wrong if we're going 3, 1, 2. Also saying "and last" at last for the second entry of a 3-item list is just not how English do. You don't go, "Ah yes, the first hero. And last, yes, finally, oh my god, at last, the second hero. And then the third hero." But why would that mean that Suzy isn't the second hero? Well, if only one of these can be Suzy, let's look at the pretty pictures. The At Last girl has a picture of Suzy's Rude Buster. Yes, this also looks like the icon for when you select Act in battle, but unfortunately the code literally calls this the symbol for Rude Buster, and it's also the symbol on Suzy's carpet. Anyway, point is, the picture for At Last was the girl is something specifically linked to Suzy. Meanwhile, the image for the second hero shows something specifically not linked to Suzy, namely a sword, a weapon she can't equip. In fact, the only girl who can equip swords is actually Noelle. Currently, there's no way to equip them to her in-game, but the code does allow Noelle to equip the Black Shard weapon and the Jingle Blade, which are both currently just Pris weapons. Of course, a shard of black isn't necessarily a sword per se, and the Jingle Blade is just Noelle's pencil, so this isn't really the end-all be-all of evidence. But luckily, there's more. Ralsei says that Suzy is supposed to be the one who equips ribbons, but she doesn't. We can assume that means the second hero was originally intended to equip ribbons as their main armor. And guess who is most heavily associated with ribbons? Noelle. Also, Gerson says that Suzy is the dragon in Dragon Blazers. According to his summary, the dragon's only role is to be stopped in Chapter 1, and I don't think the heroes stop the dragon is supposed to mean the heroes stop the dragon and then the dragon joins as the second hero of the prophecy. Perhaps all of Suzy's actions in Chapter 1 were exactly what she was prophesized to do, but Ralsei unknowingly kept forcing her into the hero's role until it stuck. This would also explain why Suzy seems to have the most freedom in her actions out of everyone so far. From the very beginning, she was actively unheroic, shocking Ralsei, who expects her to be the second hero. She can deny equipping things, she can refuse to listen to her commands, she can freely choose to break away from the party, she makes herself able to act despite that being Chris's thing, she moves freely during Tenna's minigame, Gerson straight up spells out that Suzy is supposed to be the one to break the prophecy, and right at the start of the game, we were about to partner with Noelle just for Suzy to interrupt and get us partnered with her instead. Heck, Suzy is the one who went back to repair Tenna, so if you want to use that panel as proof that something's changed, even that is because of Suzy. One sec, I've got more. It's also interesting that Suzy seems to be the entire reason Ralsei is having character development, whereas the prophecy shows he never would. The prophecy always depicts Ralsei in his cloak, and Suzy's the one who told him to take it off. Suzy being brash and rude is what encourages Ralsei to start thinking about what being Ralsei-like is. Ralsei only gets to try being player 1 because Suzy switched the controllers. Ralsei finally opens up about his knowledge because Suzy begged him to. At the very least, if Suzy is the second hero of the prophecy, she's still got something strange going on that's altering the game from its intended course. Okay, but what if she is the second hero? Because, yeah, there's plenty of counter-evidence here too. All of Suzy's prophecy-breaking habits, that doesn't necessarily mean she isn't the second hero. I mean, under the assumption that she isn't, she still has to be a fourth person being talked about in the prophecy, so you can't exactly say she's just not bound by fate or something. But most importantly, this image doesn't look like Noelle. There's kind of a big part of her silhouette that's very much missing here. Of course, she could just be in a cloak that's hiding her antlers or something, which sounds unlikely, but that's literally how she's depicted in Chapter 3's Sword Route, so it's possible. But that wouldn't explain the distinctive Suzy hair shape with the phrase at the bottom and the slight pompadour. I mean, I've also seen people say this is Suzy's snout looking upwards, but either way it works. Making this fit Noelle, though, requires a lot more compromise. On top of that, all the other images of the prophecy, including one of the first ones we see in Chapter 4, make it a lot harder to argue that this clearly antlerless, wide silhouette is somehow Noelle, and not just a classic Temmie Chang stylization of Suze. A couple smaller things. Crucially, Susie very much fits the description of girl with hope crossed on her heart. She gives Tana hope, Rousey mentions her naive, infectious hope, and Gerson says Susie has the white pen known as Hope. Noelle has had no connections with Hope thus far, although you could also read this to mean that Susie is Hope, while Noelle, if she's the second hero, has Susie crossed on her heart to symbolize Noelle's crush on her. But Rousey already knows Susie and Chris's names when we meet him in Chapter 1. How do you explain that one, Buster? Maybe he just knows everyone's names and faces, but not specifically who's each hero of the prophecy, but like, that'd be kinda weird. And if the dragon was truly separate from the second hero, wouldn't Rousey realize something's up when Susie's supposedly filling the roles of two separate parts of the prophecy? Also, yes, these prophecy pieces are clearly out of order, but that means there's no reason "and last was the girl" even needs to be referring to the heroes at all. It could be referring to something at an entirely different point in the prophecy. Though, to be honest, that one's kind of a weak defense. Why even have this panel here to sow doubt about the prophecy if it's actually just something completely normal and explainable from some random other part way later on? But if we're really committed to these all being linked to the heroes, then what about the fact that the prophecy makes no textual distinction between the girl and the girl? They're both just the girl. If these were four separate heroes, why would two of them be described the same way? No. Hold up. Maybe I'm advocating for the devil a bit too much here. Personally, I think Susie isn't the second hero, but I could totally see why people would be convinced otherwise. And hopefully I did a good job bringing up the main counter-arguments here, but there's one thing I definitely can't accept, which is the idea that this isn't showing us that there's a fourth person involved. Whether that fourth person is Susie or Noelle we can debate on, but dropping an "and last" when you've only listed one thing thus far is too crazy to ignore. But ultimately, this whole debate lands in a similar territory for me to how Chris being the knight was back in the Chapter 2 days. I can totally see the justification for either side of the argument, but believing that Susie isn't the second hero makes for far more interesting ideas to explore than if she was, which is honestly the main reason I like it. There's a smaller debate about whether Chris is the actual first hero or if it's supposed to be the vessel, because of how weirdly this panel is worded. If the hero was always Chris, that'd just mean the vessel creation was an attempt to disrupt the prophecy that failed. If it was supposed to be the vessel, that'd mean that getting put into Chris was an attempt to disrupt the prophecy that succeeded. And the ultimate consequences of either of those aren't really clear. But that's why Chris being the first hero isn't what this discourse is really about. And honestly, it'd feel weird to have 2 out of the 3 heroes of the prophecy be wrong. Like, at that point, just have all 3 of them be wrong, which is an interesting idea, but we have no reason to doubt Rousey's position quite yet. So I'm just sticking with Susie's position as a hero being the first 3 letters of her name. But hey, I'm not here to tell you what's the truth. I'm just doing a light dusting of all the thoughts people have from these new Deltarune chapters. Although, if you truly want something my screwed up brain came up with, and then also saw repeatedly in the wild throughout the very long development of this video, but I'm taking credit anyway. How about this? If Noelle is the original second hero, then the weird route could fix the prophecy, which the normal route has already broken. During Chapter 4, Rousey talks about how the prophecy only has one ending. However, in the weird route specifically, he has an extra line where he worries that a new ending like that might be even worse. This is obviously supposed to imply both that the weird route is our attempt to break the prophecy and that the new ending we reach will be worse because of it. So you're gonna have to use the power of a lot of bias here to even consider the idea that the weird route is the original prophecy. But the way I see it, if the normal path of the game is already broken with Susie not being the second hero and Rousey getting us the spare everyone, then what if that is the worst ending Rousey is accidentally foreshadowing? Yeah, I guess I'm suggesting that the normal ending will be worse than whatever the weird root is cooking up. But look, I've said it enough already, I'm not here to reach sound conclusions, so even if you don't believe me, honestly, I'm not sure if I believe myself either. At least hear me out on my evidence and thought process, because I still think there's some good points here to consider, even outside the context of this theory. Hopefully. In the end, when Deltarune is a completed game, there obviously has to be some reason a player would even feel like doing a weird route in the first place. Currently, our motivation for doing it is just that it's there to do, which, you know, was the reason people did the murder route in Undertale, but Undertale is entirely about choices. You didn't have to go out of your way to discover the genocide route. Not killing people was a deliberate choice in the first place. On the other hand, the weird route is an entirely hidden path in a game that repeatedly tells us that we can't change the story. For someone in the future who can play the whole game from start to finish, the only reason they'd even consider finding a way to avoid the normal path of the game is if there's something on the normal path they want to avoid, which would be this theoretical worse ending. But okay, that's just why this could be possible. What about actual in-game evidence of this, buckaroo? Well, it makes sense that Rousey told us to be nice and befriend people as his attempt to break the prophecy, if the original was the weird route where we very much don't do that. It's also important that Noelle here would be equipping swords now, because maybe the twisted sword we can make was never intended for Chris at all. On top of all that, Rousey is seemingly aware of and afraid of the weird route and our attempts to connect with Noelle during it, which could further support the idea that this is the prophecy he knows and is trying to avoid. Though if he's specifically wary of Noelle, then that also means he knows that Noelle is supposed to be involved in the original prophecy, which would be weird. So I honestly don't know what's up with that. Either he's really good at acting, or he's somehow aware of what's happening to Noelle without it being in the prophecy. Speaking of Noelle and the prophecy though, I think the most interesting implication here is with love finds its way to the girl, which obviously refers to the same girl as the second hero, but that's strange because saying love finds its way to Noelle is a little inaccurate when she's pretty actively seeking it out. But maybe that's because it's not referring to her crush on Susie, it's talking about the soul. On the weird route, there's a lot of focus on this bright red pixel in connection to Noelle, and notably, it's much bigger the next time we see it, which a lot of people think might symbolize a growing connection between Noelle and the soul, so that eventually we can take control of her instead of Chris. This could also be why the weird route directly calls Noelle Angel, while a lot of other things in the game suggest it could be the player, since we'd essentially be combining both potential angels into one if this were to come true. But I admit this is just a tangle of things that feel like they make sense on their own, but don't quite work together. The basic idea that Susie isn't the second hero is already pretty shaky itself, and honestly, most of my confidence in this overarching weird route theory, which is admittedly very little, is from me assuming my ideas are right, and then using them to support my other ideas that then Ouroboros back around to support the original idea. So much of the value of this theory is largely based off of the assumption that it's already true, which is not sound evidence. There's gotta be some sort of fallacy, you could call that. But like I said, the conclusion isn't the point here, it's the ideas and evidence that toying with this assumption leads us to. But okay, that's enough of that whole mess, but unfortunately, that's not the last trash heap we have to look at. Why is there so much to say about the night still? Look, I would have loved to say, well, it's Des, let's talk about how interesting Des is now, but unfortunately, it isn't that clear cut, and I want to be as broad with my info as possible, though I'll admit, I'm still quite biased on who it is. The prime option for who is the knight is December Holiday, positioned as the most clear implication from the game itself and what most lore nerds thought of immediately. Admittedly, there isn't much direct evidence for her, but honestly, all I really need is the fact that the knight summons what pretty clearly looks like a baseball bat, which, as we now know, is Dess's one defining character trait. There's a couple other pieces of evidence you could use in favor of Des, such as the fact that the code for the door leading to the night fight is 1225, the December holiday, and that the knight is this strange amorphous creature that can change shape, which no other Lightner has been shown capable of, so it being Des, this character that's in a very non-standard situation, would make sense. We even now know that Dark Worlds change depending on who opened them, so that could be why Chapter 2's Dark World had a baseball moon and looked like a big city Des said she'd take Noelle to someday. The only issue is you'd assume the night is some Dark World-only amalgamation of Des's memory or something. But in Chapter 3, Susie saw someone dragging Undyne down to the shelter in the Light World, so unless the night did a sick pass-off to someone else, that's a bit of a holdup. However, the knight's bat sure does seem to be a sword 99% of the time, doesn't it? And you know who has a black sword like that? That's right, baby, it's Carolina Holodanius. And I think that's the main evidence for it being Carol. I mean, she's scary. She's heavily associated with making the very atmosphere around her cold with her pure aura, and the knight kind of does that. And people thought the phone call Chris had was either Carol or the knight, so mash them together, and that all adds up to an evidence quantity bigger than Des, but none of it is that convincing to me. I mean, the sword thing would be pretty good, except that all of Carol's swords have hilts while the knight's doesn't, is what I would say if there weren't randomly 2 sprites where it does, which is more than the 1 sprite that makes it look like a bat, so I don't know anymore. But we can at least agree that Carol is very suspicious and likely in the know with all this stuff. It could also be Rudy, I guess. Well, to be honest, Rudy being the knight seems far more interesting and plausible to me than Carol, almost entirely because each Dark World so far has been near the hospital, and the only one that wasn't, Chapter 3, was the Dark World that took the knight the longest amount of time to reach, which would line up with Rudy being a tired, sick man hobbling his way through hometown. The problem is that he is a tired, sick man, so I doubt he could be quite that active nor evil. I'll admit that it'd give him more purpose than just to die, but Des being the knight also gives her significantly more purpose than just to not exist. Though, the antlers could always just be on the helmet and not the knight's real head. And considering the body shape matching perfectly and the visible ribcage when it roars, this could still be Papyrus. I mean, come on, that head shape is not nearly long enough to be a holiday. Oh wait, okay, I guess it's not long enough to be Papyrus either, and also that'd be stupid. Let's not hyper-accelerate the brain rot here. I think it's Des almost entirely because of the baseball bat, and that's what I'll be going forward with. I know people are already settling into it's too obvious, but clearly it isn't if we're debating this so much. I firmly believe Des is the knight, and yet all I could present is one piece of solid evidence, a bit of circumstantial evidence, and one counter-argument. There's also no direct suggestion in-game that what happened to Des is wacky enough for the casual player to assume that this is Des. So Carol is there as the answer for those who aren't thinking of December, but I think Des is still the right answer. I was a Chris Knight believer, I'm gonna be a Des Knight believer, it's how it goes. I have trust and whimsy in my soul, sue me. However, with a more solid idea of the Knight and its role in the story, you gotta ask, why is the Knight making dark fountains? Clearly it isn't to cause the roaring, otherwise it would have done that already. I mean, even Ralsei says that. But if we're looking for possible patterns here, there's a chance each Dark World was specifically opened with the goal of getting Noelle in there. Noelle was originally gonna go to the closet with Susie if Chris wasn't there. She did go to the computer lab. Chapter 3 is, I don't know, I guess an exception because it was made by Chris. But Chapter 4 was in the church, where choir practice was gonna be. Noelle would have been there, but Toriel canceled due to the rain. Actually, scratch that. Each fountain just seems broadly linked to both Noelle and Chris's past in general. Chris and presumably Noelle would play pretend with the objects from chapters 1 and 2 in the living room of chapter 3. That already ties all 3 of those up in one fell swoop. And I hope I don't need to explain the other fell swoops that tie both Chris and Noelle to the church. Of course, that doesn't particularly explain the actual purpose of making fountains in these places. I mean, it could just be some vague, try to find fragments of death thing. But then, why make a titan? I mean, yes, the knight kind of looks like one of our earlier depictions of titans, which is suspicious, but similar to the whole roaring thing, if the knight just wanted to make more of itself, make more titans from the start, why did it wait until chapter 4? It certainly wasn't to stall us, because bro had plenty of time to do whatever and get out rather than just sit waiting behind locked doors to pose on us and then go to another locked door. In fact, let's just throw out all hopes of specifics and ask the insanely broad question, what are the knight's motivations at all? The only thing the knight has actually done is unsuccessfully take Toriel and then very successfully take Undyne, and that's its own confusing mess. The immediate assumption is that the knight is kidnapping people who have the code to the shelter. I've seen that idea thrown around, and I understand where it's coming from. However, I don't think that's what's going on at all. The Deltarune in Deltarune has very little to do with Toriel specifically, and in fact, Susie even suggests that the code might be for the church, which is a much more logical location for the religious symbol code to be. Also, why would the knight need to capture people who have the code to the shelter just to bring them into the shelter? Well, I guess it could have just taken away Undyne to prevent us from getting the code, which actually makes a lot of sense, huh? But why the Toriel involvement? Whatever it is, I think the knight was taking Toriel slowly to deliberately not let her wake up. Tenna even stressed that it'd be dangerous for Toriel to be awake for this, so I'm honestly leaning towards the idea that taking Undyne so quickly and immediately was more of a panic response to being seen. Relatable, am I right? Except, could it really be a panic response when Chris set up everything deliberately for Undyne to appear? Maybe Chris getting Undyne to show up was their attempt to disrupt the knight and prevent it from taking Toriel, since Chris is already reluctant to go along with all this, and taking their mom might have been too much. But they only seem to start going against this whole plan right at the end of chapter 4. Were they already second-guessing it all as soon as the end of chapter 2? Maybe Undyne appearing was an actual accident. Chris could have slashed the tires only to get Susie to stay the night and not to get Toriel to call the police, and opened the door only to leave a way for the knight to easily get in and out with Toriel. Again, quite sketchy speculation, but it's at least something, because otherwise, I'll just tentatively say there's a chance the knight isn't even going for any kind of goal, nor is it truly working with anyone. Chris and Carol might just be trying to tug the knight in the right directions to bring back Des, especially since if this truly is Des, the rowdy, rambunctious teen in demon form, I doubt she'd be willing to work with Carol, the strict, stuck-up adult. But the knight deliberately holds back against Chris. Even when fully downed, Chris simply kneels in silence. Meanwhile, Susie and Rousey are mega dead. So this isn't exactly some wild beast that Chris and Carol are trying to extract Des from. I don't know, it's just a mess. Luckily for us, I think we can finally unwind and run through some of the cool new info we've learned about every other major character individually. Chris. Of course we're starting with Chris. Chris's previous links to doing magic demon summonings with Caddy have been more heavily confirmed, but not expanded on. Though the fact that it's being brought up again at all lends credence to the idea that it's something important, like Chris summoned the player or something like that. On that note, it's a lot more clear that Chris does not want us around, but has to have us here anyway. And that's likely because there seems to be some sort of team formed between Chris, the knight, and possibly Carol. I mean, for one, Chris clearly knows more about the knight than we do. When you check the knight, it specifically says that Chris analyzed the enemies and Chris couldn't learn anything, implying that they already know about the knight. Obviously, we could probably learn a thing or two, but that's not who analyzed the enemy. And later, this dialogue seems to heavily suggest that Chris knows what the knight looks like under the helmet and doesn't want us to know, or just doesn't like thinking about it. There's also this much more loose connection with how Chris and the Knight do a lot of similar key poses, though I suppose that's suggesting a deeper connection beyond just working together. But most clear and suspicious of them all, Chris is either let into the shelter at the end of Chapter 3 or knows the code to open the door themselves. As I mentioned like a moment ago, the Knight goes easy on Chris, but this whole pulling punches thing doesn't just go one way. Chris also deals significantly reduced damage against the Knight in battle, and if you manage to... if you get to the Knight in Chapter... if you're actually good at video games, Chris refuses to do anything to stop the Knight here. Although it seems like Chris's love for their friends is greater than their willingness to help the Knight, because their damage against it spikes when Susie and Ralsei are killed. That is, unless you believe that this is actually Chris's doing. It's something I personally don't believe, because it seems like Chris genuinely cares about Susie and Ralsei enough to not do that, but I admit that I have no idea why the slashes seemingly come from the left, nor why Ralsei would say, "How could you?" in this scenario if it wasn't some sort of betrayal, so it's an interesting thing to keep in mind, but if you're really curious about a full casual exploration of this idea, my favorite kind of idea exploration, then I recommend just watching the original theory video and its follow-up by DoubleDan. As for Carol's involvement in this team, she allows Chris to be over at her home when no one else really seems welcome. But more crucially, Chris calls Carol to deal with Susie getting the guitar. Well, we don't know for certain if the voice on the phone is Carol or not, but for now, I'll just assume Carol is part of this unlikely trio rather than calling her phone person. Anyway, it seems like Chris might be reluctant, at least with all this, because Phone Person has to deliberately remind them of their promise so they don't go run off with Susie at the end of Chapter 4. And if you'd allow me to get so crazy, just straight wacky, completely out of pocket with a prediction, I'd guess that Chris's deal is to help find Des in some way. And this deal forces them to keep the player around, probably just to seal Dark Fountains after the Dark World has fulfilled whatever purpose it's being opened for in the first place. Which honestly just leaves Chris as an unwilling Malcolm stuck in the middle of this plan where they have to give up their own autonomy to be the cage that restrains the players so Phone Guy can use us for whatever. A possible reason that Chris is stuck with the worst role in this dynamic is that it's implied in a couple places that Chris may have potentially killed someone in the past, or at least had an urge to do so. Good to see the Kara side of Chris is staying strong. The Shadow Mantle says Chris probably enjoyed the weird route because they could say they weren't really the one doing it, and the Chapter 4 Egg Room seems like a memory of somewhere Chris went in the past, an art therapy room where they draw pictures and don't kill each other. Very subtle. My current idea is that Chris killed Des in some way, and that's why they're stuck in a promise to bring her back. Maybe the death was an accident, or maybe people just think Chris did it and it was actually entirely unrelated. But at the very least, it's clearly something they regret and hate themselves for. Obviously not like the Kara I know, but we have no solid way of knowing for sure if this is actually related to Des or not. Susie! I've already talked at length about all of Susie's interesting things, the blood, the prophecy, yeah. But man, who would have thought that Susie of all characters would be one of the most important... okay, basically everyone was clocked onto Susie being important. But anyway, Ralsei! Bro still just shows up at every Dark World, and we have no further evidence of how. The most popular explanation still seems to be that he's the Darkner version of an object Chris happens to have on them at all times. Before Chapter 3, a lot of people thought Ralsei could be Chris's red horn headband they wore when they were little. There's still no strong evidence of this either way, but I will point out that Chapter 3's minigames specifically reference the red horns, so having the horns also be Ralsei when they were already acknowledged elsewhere makes the idea less likely to me. However, there is a second, more taboo option for Ralsei that I kind of brushed past earlier. Maybe he's a Darkner made from Azrael's dust. When JaruJaruJ first proposed this idea back in the days of Yonder, it was mainly just speculation, as the only real foundational evidence was Ralsei's a weird Darkner. But let's reapproach this from a post-Chapter 4 perspective. When Jaru added the idea of Oberon Smog, a darkener made of Gerson's dust, Jaru said that the narrative purpose of introducing a character like that would be to establish the idea that darkeners can be made of monster dust in order to set up for the twist reveal that Azrael is not at college, he is dead, and his dust is Ralsei. So the fact that we now have that idea actually established is already a more solid reason to consider this option. But there's more to it than just that. I said Chris might have killed Des in the past, but what's going on with Des also seems like more than just getting killed, so there's a non-zero chance that Chris instead killed Azrael, giving us the dust for this crime. However, Ralsei says that darkeners revived from monster dust need special conditions in order to exist. We don't know what those special conditions are, but many people take it to mean that the one opening the fountain needs to have some connection to the Lightner, which is a fair assumption, since the only difference we know for sure between the main church Dark World and Susie's is that this one was made by Susie, who never knew Gerson. So that would mean Ralsei can't be Azrael's dust since Susie didn't know Azrael either, and yet he still shows up in her Dark World. There's also a chance the special conditions are something else entirely, because that's just kind of an idea that's popular and not really the most likely. But to poke another hole of doubt in the ship, there's repeatedly moments in these chapters of Chris pointing out differences between Ralsei and Azrael, implying that they don't look nearly as identical as Gerson and his Darkener version do. So while Ralsei being similar to Azrael is clearly important, them specifically being the same is less likely. Anyway, I think the reason Ralsei keeps showing up is just that the Dark World is likely a single connected world and the fountains just let part of it seep out into the light. So Ralsei isn't especially notable for going anywhere, he's just walking around the darkness to wherever a new fountain appears. Some other little updates on Ralsei. That whole thing where he kept talking to Chris without the player around. Yeah, in Chapter 3, Ralsei makes us close our eyes, and when we come back, nothing. In Chapter 4, he does it again, but this time we know what he's doing. He was going around breaking the final prophecy panel some more to prevent us from seeing it, but like, that doesn't answer what he was doing every other time. It somehow feels like we have less info now because we have to ask why he's doing something different each time. Also, it seems like Ralsei doesn't have as much exclusive knowledge as we thought. All Darkeners seem to know what objects they are and what the layout of the light world is, but at the same time, he knew the piano codes in Chapter 4 already, which is incredibly specific, so maybe his knowledge is deep but not vast, if you catch my drift. Speaking of drift, wow, look at him schmoove, Pro can fly. I know it was only there for like 2 seconds and I have no idea why or what significance it could have, but Ralsei can fly and just chooses not to all the time. Noelle. Still solidly important, since there's been no other party members, but we already knew she was important since Chapter 2. It's also confirmed that the Weird Route is entirely dependent on her, and beyond that, there isn't really anything to say about Noelle specifically. But that's only because we now need to talk about the Angel. Yes, the Angel gets to be its own whole character section because the two possibilities for who could be the Angel have become too powerful to be contained to their own individual discussion points. While the only new connections we got between the Angel and Noelle were that she has angel wings in her closet, her previous numerous connections from Chapter 2 are still going strong. I mean, she's literally called Angel multiple times in the Weird Route. However, these new chapters have actually given us more solid evidence for the Angel being the player. For example, the fact that we don't see the picture for the Angel's part of the prophecy would make sense if it was the player, since there would literally be no way to actually show a picture of the Angel accurately without just turning on a face cam or something. And Susie's skeptical reaction to it could be read as, I don't know, dude, that thing looks so weird and horrific, because it looked like a realistic human face in this cartoon world. I mean, it could be, I don't know, dude, that looks like Noelle. I don't think that's right. But I feel like if it looked like Noelle, Susie would have just pointed that out instead of being weirded out. There's also the potential symbolism, for all those symbolism lovers still around, of when we, the player, get trapped under an angel ornament. And if you want to get a little more abstract, the Titans seem connected to the angel in some way due to all the angel wings and the roaring being similar to the angel's heaven and whatnot. But you can also connect the Titans to us with how the Titan is initially shown with the silhouette of what looks like a realistic human face, and once revealed, its actual face resembles a save point, a power that the player controls. So yeah, now I'm just kind of confused on why Noelle is connected so heavily to angels when it seems like it's supposed to be the player. I mean, there was that potential taking over Noelle in the weird route explanation from earlier, but why don't we just look at what the connotations of being the angel could mean for each candidate to help us decide. For one, what would be the angel's heaven that we banish at the end? For Noelle, that could just be a massive dark world she creates to escape all of her problems. A popular idea is that Rudy will die and the grief will cause her to create a dark world where he can be revived and she won't have to face her troublesome real life anymore. Therefore, banishing the angel's heaven would just be sealing her dark fountain, which makes sense with how the prophecy depicts the banishing. For the player, our heaven could be Deltarune itself, as obviously we care about the game deeply if we've made it that far, so banishing it would just be the game ending. The depiction of banishing the angel's heaven could even be showing the heroes in front of a Titan fountain specifically, which, you know, Titans might connect to the player for reasons I listed like a minute ago. Hopefully you were paying attention to that. But the second important part of the angel is that Chapter 4's prophecy says the angel banished will finally meet with its desire, which honestly might just be the actual version of events, and Rousey's angel's heaven was never real at all, but either way, what would this desire be that requires the angel to be banished first? Well, if the player is the angel, this could just be the desire for a happy ending to the game, which would require us to stop playing it for it to happen. Or, since we're specifically meeting our desire, it could be about meeting Gaster by being banished from the world of Deltarune and meeting him in whatever wacky out of time and space zone he's in. If Noelle is the angel, this could much more simply mean that we banish Noelle into the code of the game where she'll finally meet Des, her desire. Speaking of which, December holiday. Even when detached from the night, Des retains quite a few talking points of her own. We finally caught a glimpse of her, and she has antlers. God, there was this single line in the Xbox version of Undertale where Sans mentions the antlered girl and her big sis, and that's obviously in reference to Noelle as the antlered girl and Des as the big sis. Especially since a lot of people say Noelle can't be the sus one, if you catch my drift. But there was a large chunk of people that, for whatever reason, thought that implied the big sis didn't have antlers, which that's just a stupid way of reading it. What did you want it to say? The antlered girl and her antlered big sis? That's dumb. You're dumb. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't actually care that much. But like, I don't know, man. It just ain't the vibe. In other news, much like the pop-ups in Chapter 2 giving us a bunch of lore from their ads, for some reason the Ribics give us some lore about Des, and Asriel for that matter. Unfortunately, what we learn from this pretty much just reaffirms the image of Des we got from her room, which is just tomboy. But hey, at least we know a bit more about Asriel, who it honestly feels like we know even less about than Des at this point. More importantly than any of that though, Raise Up Your Bat by Blood Crushers the Band is a song that's heavily implied to at least be connected to Des due to bats being Des's whole thing, and also that part where it just breaks out into the lost girl motif, so we can do some epic analysis on these lyrics to learn a little bit more about her. There's references to your heart being a guiding light. I'm hesitant to say that means Des knows about Chris's soul and its powers, but if you want to be crazy with it, you could say this might mean Des needs Chris or the player to guide her out from the code with the power of the soul? I don't know. It also seems like D.Og, the quote-unquote song in Chapter 2 that plays only during the weird route, might be a heavily modified version of Raise Up Your Bat. At least it matches rhythm-wise, which is probably important. And, you know, the song titled D could be short for Des, like how Carol's theme is just called C. And Raise Up Your Bat also references Don't Forget, perhaps implying that Don't Forget is also about, or by, Des in some way. But to be honest, it feels like Don't Forget itself can't tell us much new info anymore. Like, the meaning of each line feels pretty clear now. The first 4 lines are just describing what a dark world is. The next 2 talk about Chris's soul being able to produce light. Maybe the allusion to cold is significant, but this is still pretty cut and dry. The next 2 are much less clear, though they could easily be about Chris's promise that the voice on the phone reminds them of at the end of chapter 4. And then the last 2 just seem to suggest that the person singing is always with us in the dark world, which would make sense if Des is the one singing this, because... Though it is somewhat interesting that the order of these lines seems to parallel the order of the information we learned, potentially implying that Chris's promise will be very relevant next chapter, and that the person singing, probably Des, will be revealed at the end of the game. The only other thing of note with Des is that the voice in the code could still be her consciousness or something. Chapter 4's code text suggests that the scratching sound she heard during Chapter 2's is just us reaching into the code to find her. And Chapter 3's does describe a nightmare similar to how Chris and Susie fell into Castletown in Chapter 1. This could be about Des getting locked into the shelter, since we know the shelter is a dark world, so entering it would probably feel similar to how Susie and Chris entered the closet, but that's working off a lot of assumptions. Still nothing that really connects it to Des specifically. Birdley. He's like, not important as a character, but he is important somewhat just due to the fact that he's the only person in town who's not directly involved with the Fun Gang's Dark World train, but has still been to a Dark World. He's just kinda not too important, not too unimportant, you know? Rudy. Still sick. Carol. We were right about her name and her being the mayor, so good job on us. But okay, is she the voice on Chris's phone or not? To be honest, I don't know who it could be if not her. Chris calls someone to stop Susie with the guitar, and Carol's the one to stop her. And we hear her completely normal voice from the phone at the end of the weird route, which to me confirmed even stronger that it's her all the time, but to more normal people, that's actually the main reason to doubt that it's her, because why would she talk totally normally now and not every other time she's on the phone? And I mean, Asgore actually shows up first and disrupts Susie with the guitar in basically the only way he can socially get away with. But I don't think it's him. He's entirely occupied in the house while Chris is on the phone earlier, so it could be the Knight, but the Knight so far has not spoken at all. And like, Carol literally inspects the guitar after taking it from Susie, like she's making sure the code is still there. It has to be her, surely. I will say though, I don't think Carol is the only voice on the phone. Every line about how Susie shouldn't get the guitar is entirely in red. It could just be emphasis, but considering how disconnected those statements are from the rest of the phone conversation, I feel like there's at least something sketchy going on. And my guess is that it's 2 people here holding a group chat while Chris just vibes with some Nesquik. But for the same reasons that I have no idea who would be the phone voice other than Carol, I also have no idea who else could be on the call with Carol. Besides that, Carol's clearly also working with Asgore on something sketchy, probably connected with all this Des stuff too, and Toriel and Rudy both seem aware of what's going on, with Toriel even straight disrespecting Carol for it. Though aware of what's going on might be a bit generous, I suspect that they just know that Asgore and Carol are obsessively working to find Des, not that Chris has been infected with an eldritch horror from beyond their comprehension. Nor are they likely aware of the Knight at all. Though, honestly, I'm not sure how much Carol is either. She might not even be working with it, because if she is, that makes her goal a bit more confusing. Her goal wouldn't be to find Des, as we originally thought, but more so just reviving whichever part of Des she can manage to scratch out of the Knight, and like, that works, but find her is a much more clear-cut goal. As for Asgore, he has a black shard. Now, whether that's a shadow crystal or just a piece of the knight's sword is unfortunately not super clear, as they're both described similarly in the light world. I'd lean towards the one called Black Shard, but either way, it's still significant and shows a connection between Asgore and the knight. It'd be hilarious if Carol didn't actually know that much about the knight, while Asgore has fought and defeated it before. I mean, obviously Asgore is working with Carol, but I think they aren't fully let in on the other's whole deal. Carol supports Asgore financially, and Asgore can wander around Carol's house freely, even into her room. But they have separate corkboards, which would just be a little odd if they were fully sharing everything they know with each other. But at least we can now more solidly say that Asgore getting fired and divorced seems to be because of Dess's disappearance and his actions relating to it. No matter what though, Asgore is shaping up to be honestly way more important than I thought he would. I thought Undertale characters wouldn't get any huge focus in Deltarune, but this guy's even shown in the prophecy in his Undertale design, meaning this is likely him in a dark world. The fact that his flowers are here and that Gerson's summary of Chapter 5 mentions a vast garden, and all the other reasons Asgore's now significant, make it pretty likely that Flower King is going to be the next Dark World location. In fact, the prophecy panel of Asgore is even labeled as Boss 3 in the code. Bosses 1 and 2 are the Queen and Tenna panels, so bro's gonna be important. But we can't forget his foil, Sans. Previously, the most important thing about Sans was his connection to Undertale and his quirky meta-dialogue. There isn't anything new on the meta-dialogue list, but with Susie now showing that monsters in Deltarune can bleed, that just further supports that Sans Undertale is the same as Sans Deltarune, since Sans bleeds when no other Undertale monsters did. Though it is interesting to note that no other Undertale monsters includes Papyrus. Undertale Papyrus doesn't seem to be from Deltarune. He doesn't bleed, he's never seen a human before, and he doesn't even know what the sun is. I think that Undertale Sans truly lost everything, including his original brother. Meanwhile, in Deltarune, bro has not gone through character development yet. But that's actually the most significant thing about Sans now. He's literally befriending our mom as we speak. To paraphrase some analysis, which you should check out in full from It's Raining Somewhere Else expert Vivat Veritas, the fact that the place where it rained plays just before this scene means that this is not only directly linked to its respective Undertale scene, but is perhaps the most important part of Sans' Deltarune life, since this is the moment he's recalling in Undertale. That Undertale scene is where Sans tells us about his connection with Toriel through the ruin's door and how important it is to him, while this Deltarune scene is where we see him starting that deep connection. The connection that, in Undertale, is what kept us alive. Something I see people often forget about Sans Undertale is that he says his relationship with Toriel is the only reason Frisk didn't die the moment they stepped out of the ruins. Now, there's no reason to think Sans would want to kill Chris currently, because there's no big magical barrier that you need human souls to break. However, Sans still remains as one of the only characters with direct ties to Gaster, who is clearly important, and something crazy has to happen for Sans to end up in Undertale, so look, all I'm saying is maybe you should be a little more grateful about his relationship with your mother, Chris. You don't know what this guy's capable of. Well, Alvin turned out to be slightly important for basically all the reasons people thought he'd be the knight. He may have even made Chapter 4's Dark World, probably tricked into doing so by the Night Gang with the promise of seeing Garson alive. He also likely has one of the codes to the shelter, so that could tie him into the bigger picture. And for all we know, he may have been taken by the Night like Undyne without us seeing. But considering Undyne also knew one of the codes but showed no signs of being in the know, I doubt that Alvin is that important. I mean, he still hasn't overcome his crippling lack of dialogue portrait or unique text sounds. Although, on that note, these chapters have been really stingy with portraits. Out of all the characters added in these chapters, the only one to get a portrait was Carol. Honestly, it's probably because the sprite animation budget is so high now that the overall sprites can emote just as well as dialogue portraits can. Though with this new exclusivity, it might be worth paying more attention to those seemingly unimportant characters who do have portraits already. Speaking of which, Lancer and Rules card. They showed up in Chapter 3, establishing a pattern of them showing up in each chapter, then they didn't show up in Chapter 4, immediately breaking that pattern. Whether them coming along in each chapter will still be the case, and Chapter 4 was just an exception, or if they only showed up for the fun beginning chapters of the game and now won't show up for this new serious era, is impossible to predict. I personally hope they do show up again, mainly because I think the idea of Rules card being a progressively more serious, harder boss is really fun. And Rules also now has the Rules card, which can change the rules of battle, something that's very powerful and could easily set him up for being a real threat later. Sham is quirky. All their previous notable traits are still there with basically no new info. They still know who all the secret bosses are, including that Chapter 3's was the Knight, which is strange because of how much the Knight seemed like an outlier, but their foreboding foreshadowing about how you don't want to get caught when the sun goes down seems to have not meant much. Chapter 3 was a dark world made when the sun was down, and we wandered around hometown during the night in Chapter 4, so I really don't know what was up with that. Maybe it was just in reference to the night seemingly only coming out at night, but regardless, Sham's still going to be important, that's obvious. Just didn't learn much new. Except that they're on Asriel's computer wallpaper. That probably means that Sham was Asriel's doll left in the unused classroom. This feels like a big deal, but I don't really have any further thoughts about it beyond just explaining potentially why Sham's so knowledgeable and important, which is neat.
The result, Darkners are not sociopaths.
He's so original. Starwalker. Okay, but now there's kind of a reason to be suspicious of his starry shape, because the Titan has a star for a face. Though I think that has more interesting implications for the Starbirds in Chapter 1, who are stars with wings and didn't seem to represent anything specifically in the unused classroom, which would unfortunately mean that the unoriginal Starbirds might be more important than the beloved Walker. Onion. Not here. But that doesn't mean there isn't anything to talk about. First of all, it's a little unclear, but I think waiting by the lake during the day section of Chapter 4 actually fails this quest line, I guess you could call it, because that's what blocks you off from accessing the lake later, since this dumb, stupid bird is here. But the main thing of note with all this is the dumb, stupid bird, because what are they? This is the one Gaster follower with no NPC counterpart in Undertale, so having them show up in Deltarune was already suspicious, but they were just a pretty normal NPC. In fact, that's literally their name in the code. But something's up with them now. They're going all weird, and I honestly have no clue why. At the very least, there's likely going to be some vague connection to Gaster, and since this dumb, stupid bird is stopping us from accessing the pond if we do so too early, that basically means the Song from the Sea is directly linked to Gaster, and my dad is Toby Fox, so he can confirm. There's also the other continuing storyline with Metaton, but it seems like continuously meeting him each day was just building up to giving him Tana, so that plotline seems to be resolved, and I doubt there's much more to it. Similarly, Pizza Burger Pants does not seem to actually be as important as I once suspected. It just seems like he's gonna get into an epic gay relationship with Blue Ears. Though, while Pizza Burg seems less important, the mascot of his place of work is still in its weird limbo significance. Of course, there's the icy van in the start of Chapter 3, but also those silhouettes of things coming out of the pipes during Tenna's epic breakdown are 100% icy. And I don't just mean in terms of shape, I also mean the sprite is literally icy, just turned all black to be a silhouette. And Chapter 4's library says the icy that used to be there will be removed, which has Chris feel a wave of dread. In the last chapter, it being there made them feel relief, which, well, I'll just admit, the entire concept of reading into all these pretty clearly jokes feels ridiculous. but that's my favorite part of all the icy stuff. If you're normal, it all just seems like weird jokes. If you're weird, it feels like these are all esoteric hints at some horrific ice cube creature in Hometown. And if you're normal again, the sequel, looking at people analyzing all these clues feels like watching someone who swears the Teletubbies is actually secretly demonic symbolism or something. But that's exactly what Icy wants you to think. Jockington and Caddy weren't part of Chapter 4's Dark World at all, so... But people have noticed a possible connection between these two with the ever-mysterious friend. Namely, cat, tail, pink and yellow, demon summoning, degrading speech like the dumb stupid bird, which is connected to Gaster, which might be connected to friend maybe, and the general fact that they're clearly going to be important eventually, so might as well be this. Everyman. Nothing new, literally nothing with him. Almost insane how little Everyman there was. He was everywhere in the first 2 chapters, and now, bro fell off. So did Gaster, for that matter. Obviously, he's still gonna be important in the end. I mean, he's still tied to the shelter and the Dark Worlds as a whole, but the idea of Gaster being the mastermind puppeting every single thing in this game seems less likely. It felt clear that Gaster was giving out the shadow crystals and making the secret bosses go crazy, considering Sham referenced Darker Yet Darker when talking about Jevil, and the Addisons referenced the Entry 17 Gaster noise that comes from your phone when talking about Spampton. But now we know that Jevil only met the Knight, and that the Knight seems to be responsible for handing out shadow crystals, meaning the old Gast just isn't doing much directly. I'd say that Gaster was just originally planning to do something with the vessel, but ever since that got interrupted, he's just been sitting back like, alright, fine, let's see how this goes. On the other hand, professional Gaster look-alike, or I guess vibe-alike, since we don't know what either of them look like, the man behind the tree has become way more important. To start, we've learned his schedule, and it lines up with all the places we can find him each chapter. On Thursday, I go to sell the donuts. Chapter 1's egg room spits you out at the bake sale, and the actual room you go back and forth in is the room where you have to spin around a circle like a donut. On Friday, I toss the leftovers in the dumpster. Chapter 2's egg is by a dumpster. On Saturday, I let it cool on the windowsill. This actually skips Chapter 3's egg and tells us how to get Chapter 4's, which is by going back and forth in a window. On Sunday, I harvest the wheat. I guess Chapter 5's egg will be related to wheat somehow, considering we're pretty certain that chapter will be in Flower King and will just be a vast field of crops. This is uniquely unhelpful, but there is one last hint. Hold your breath, head to the left, and count backwards to 100. It's not clear if this is a continuation of Chapter 5's hint, or is maybe Chapter 6's egg hint, or maybe even nothing at all. And is there any significance in the fact that these steps, if we're taking them to describe the actual process of making and selling donuts, are not in chronological order, but would instead be 5, 4, 1, 2? As well as there being a suspicious absence of a baking step of the process? Probably not. But the schedule at least confirms the day of each chapter, which we could already sort of intuit, but it's still nice to confirm. This is somewhat significant though, because at the start of the game, Toriel said Azrael will return from college next week, and now we know that could be as early as Chapter 5, since that's the start of the next week. Although I still think it's safe to assume that Azrael will show up later than that. He might not even show up in the game at all if he just chooses to get back on Wednesday. Outside of that, strangely, there's nowhere to put the eggs in Chapters 3 or 4, unlike Asgore's fridge in Chapter 1 and Sansa's shop in 2. When talking to the Eggman, he does explicitly call out that we should put the eggs somewhere, so this feels crucial, but Chapter 3 doesn't even have a light world opportunity for you to put the egg somewhere before it gets removed. And 4's only post-egg light world section is at night, with nearly everywhere closed, not giving you the opportunity to place it anywhere either. The eggs still count even if you didn't put them anywhere, so perhaps putting them in certain places in Chapters 1 and 2 was just a fun joke and not actually a significant step after finding them in the first place. Speaking of finding the eggs though, there's achievements on PlayStation for completing each chapter without issue. But the only thing that prevents you from getting these achievements is obtaining the egg in each chapter. The weird route doesn't prevent it, the shadow crystals don't prevent it. No, apparently the only issue is obtaining an egg. Now, much of the point of the PlayStation achievements is that they're all incredibly easy to do, but secretly possible to avoid, just for some fun bonus dialogue at the end of Chapter 4, acknowledging how incredible you are at doing nothing noteworthy. So the importance of these achievements is suspect, but they appear to be written by Gaster himself, meaning they have to at least be somewhat notable, and that make this the only direct connection between the eggs and Gaster thus far. The Eggman's rooms have also become much more interesting than just some normal location with a tree. In fact, it almost seems like the Eggman himself represents a repressed memory for Chris, because Chapter 4's room has Chris draw what's behind the tree and then cover it up more and more until there's only a tree to see. Maybe he's specifically a repressed memory Chris has of Gaster, but still the only reason we think there's a connection between the Eggman and Gaster is just that they're both mysterious. It's also interesting that the Chapter 4 room specifically talks about Chris in the third person instead of you, almost as if to make it very clear that this is an analogy about Chris, completely independent of the player. And when washing your hands afterwards, it says you can never wash it all away, which may relate to Chris's guilt for whatever, probably murder they did. Or, I suppose this is more of a Chris analysis at this point, but it could be suggesting that Chris is, in some way, the vessel. As Chapter 3's egg room pointed out, the copies are usually gray but can get colored in, so Chris could just be the colored in vessel, and the gray graphite being left is hinting at that. So, yeah, Egg Dude and his titular eggs have become a bit more important to the story than at least I expected. The same, however, can't be said of some other patterns of interest we thought would continue from Chapters 1 and 2. Dragon Blazers and its parallels to Deltarune were a crucial part of Chapter 2 theorizing, and now we know that Dragon Blazers is based on Lord of the Hammer, which is based on the prophecy, so using Dragon Blazers as a parallel to Deltarune has a valid justification now, and there were no further mentions of the game. I mean, Chapter 3's mantle minigame is implied to be Dragon Blazers because of your status after you beat parts of it, even though neither of the title screens we see are actually Dragon Blazers. But hey, maybe that's some more evidence that the Weird Route is the original prophecy, since that game is about the Weird Route. Maybe that means when your sister gets cursed in Dragon Blazers 2 was not foreshadowing at all, and the sister being cursed was just Noelle being weirded by the Weird Route from Chapter 2 of Deltarune. But obviously there's no concrete reasoning for each Dragon Blazers game to equal one chapter, other than it'd be a nice parallel. But Noelle does mention the Ice Palace is in Dragon Blazers 3, and Deltarune's Ice Palace shows up in Chapter 3, so who knows? There were also a couple small details that we really thought would be important, like how to draw dragons, which in the end just turned out that in Chapter 4 you get Susie catching a glimpse of it and being like, "Aw, boobs, sick," slightly paraphrased. And the whole thing with the wet-nosed bandits being afraid of something they found near the Holiday household is probably just a joke about Carol being really scary. But some things that are slightly more important that they turned out less important than we thought are two songs, Lost Girl and Flashback. Now, don't get me wrong, these are still significant motifs, but Lost Girl is used more like a generic somber song than a major Death leitmotif, considering it plays for Susie and even Ralsei, who is not a lost girl by the way. It seems that the specific uses are not as important as the connotation of the motif itself. There's always the chance that it's similar to his theme in Undertale, which, as a motif, was also used in a wide variety of contexts, but was still a specific theme for Asriel. And considering the most plot-crucial uses of this theme are still related to Death, I'd say connecting it to Death is still justified. At the same time, Flashback was originally a song exclusive to Chapter 2's Weird Route that sounded very gastery, and yet it's now used as a more generic, creepy song in the newer chapters with not much direct connections to the Weird Route or Gaster, which those connections, of course, may not have existed in the first place. I mean, it wasn't even part of Chapter 2's soundtrack, meaning its use in the Weird Route was not at all its main purpose. Chapter 3 using it for, surprise surprise, flashbacks seems to have always been its main intention. And also, it may sound Gastery, but it isn't actually Gaster's theme directly at any point. Gaster's theme is famous for being so simple that any pattern of 4 notes could sound like it. Though this is only an excerpt of what I guess would be a full flashback song in the future, so this still has some potential importance later. But now for all the things that we thought were important, and still are, or might even be more so than before. Starting with the ever-elusive shadow crystals. In Chapter 3's Dark World, looking through the shadow crystal still just shows us the light world, but in a slightly more interesting flavor this time. In the light world with Noelle in your party, it says that you saw Noelle close to you, whispering. Which is interesting considering it previously showed Chris not existing at all, so I don't know who she's whispering to. Or I guess it just showed Chris's hand not existing. So, plausible deniability. Also, in Chapter 4's Dark World, it says that the prophecy is not changed by the shadow crystals, meaning whatever it's showing us is not a version of the world with the prophecy changed, which is all well and good, but doesn't make the purpose of shadow crystals any clearer than before. Unless... God, I'm bringing this up again. Unless you think that the normal route of the game has already broken the prophecy and the shadow crystals are showing us the world that follows the prophecy correctly. Chris isn't around because we'd be the vessel. Susie is angry because she wouldn't have been forced into the character development of being the second hero. Noelle is... here. I honestly don't know what that one would mean still. And obviously that suggests that the Dark Worlds aren't part of the prophecy at all originally, which is a ridiculous suggestion, so this idea doesn't hold much weight, but it's the best I can do at the moment. The philosopher enemies in Chapter 4 have some interesting dialogue surrounding the prophecy, one of which is the truth sung in glass, which, let's be fair, is there any other significant glass in the game? So this might suggest that what the shadow crystals show us are the truth? Which I suppose you could use to support the idea that they're showing us a world that's following the prophecy correctly, but again, quite unclear. Continuing off the glass connections, there's a book hidden in Chapter 4 which says, "And so wept the fallen star, making rivers with its tears. Then, slowly from the bitter water something grew. It looked like glass." Which implies the shadow crystals are tears? And that's kind of interesting because when we first see the night, it looks like it's crying, so woohoo, the shadow crystals are connected to the night. Yippee! But it's interesting to think that the crystals are the knight's tears specifically, especially since if you attempt to toss one away now that we've met the knight, the dialogue has changed from just feeling wrong to do so to feeling like throwing away someone's which is, again, interesting, but God if I know what that means. What about the Dark Worlds themselves? Well, there were a couple patterns with the first 3 Dark Worlds that Chapter 4's breaks. The first was that they seemed to be connected to abandoned locations. Unused classroom, computer lab that people don't go in since the internet went down, TV that hasn't been used for years, but the church was literally used earlier in the same day, so that one's down the drain. They also all seemed to be connected to entertainment, board games, computers, and TV. But the church was just religion? I mean, there was a lot of music-related stuff, so maybe this is still on the table, but it's probably more that each Dark World is themed around escapism, since entertainment is escapism, and you could reasonably argue that following religion too closely could be used as a way to escape your troubles. Plus, the heavily likely Flower King Dark World could still relate to escapism in the sense of avoiding your problems by focusing on work, but all this is pretty loose too, and obviously escapism is just the major theme of Deltarune as a whole, so any specific Dark World patterns here seem weaker. In fact, the connections between Dark Worlds with dreams and fiction somehow did not get strengthened by either of these chapters, but are at least still there. You could still sleep at the start of Chapter 4 to go straight to the Dark World, and for fiction, Gerson shows up. But Toriel and Susie already being asleep as they entered the Dark World didn't lead to anything special, and Gerson, a fiction author, didn't talk about any specific links between creating Dark Worlds and the idea of creating fiction, so I still think the ties are there, but not as prominently. However, the connections between Dark Worlds and the ocean did get some significant shakeups. First, probably the most hidden of these connections, because I'm sure most people just immediately destroyed this conch shell on sight, but if you actually check this as Chris, it says it's surrounded by glass and sounds like the ocean, possibly connecting shadow crystals to the ocean. Yes, I know that conch shells just famously sound like ocean water normally, but this has gotta be significant somehow, okay? More obviously, though, is that all the prophecy panels in Chapter 4 use the same depths image as the Dark Fountains, which, as a refresher, is just a modified picture of the ocean. That by itself wouldn't be that significant if it weren't for the continuous mentions of the Song from the Sea. It isn't just Onion anymore. Gerson mentions the old song Singing from the Deep right before his fight. Although he claims it's the ringing of the Hammer of Justice, which hammers don't ring, so I'm not sure what our takeaway here should be. Maybe this just means the Song from the Sea is the freedom motif? Because I kind of doubt that it'd be something specific to Gerson himself. It seems more broadly important than that. However, at the end of Chapter 4, if you sit where Onion usually is, Susie hears a song from across the lake, confirming that this is a real song we might be able to hear at some point, although there isn't actually any song playing, don't get it twisted. There's also some new connections to rain specifically. Of course, there's all that rain going on in Chapter 4 itself and the possible relevance to sands. But that book about tears turning to shadow crystals, obviously tears are water, but there's a specific bitter tear item which is implied to just be rain, which to me at least seems to be creating this trio of connections between tears, rain, and shadow crystals. One of these three seem a little bit out of place. But if the link between rain and shadow crystals holds any water, I think it's also worth noting that when Spamton's eyes turn to static, that's not just static, but rain as well. You could also make a tentative link between rain and all the snow significance, because rain is just warm snow. But we might be going too far with that point. Yes, your choices don't matter. The theme of Deltarune that once seemed like the most important concept of the game, and now I almost forgot to even include here because, it's pretty obvious that this idea is both being positioned as a hard rule of this world, with the prophecy predicting everything, but is also the main source of conflict with us wanting to defy it. It's so obvious that it almost feels like there's not much to read into, but we at least learned some new info related to it, like how even Rousey wants to break the prophecy, or how Gerson really seems to emphasize Susie's role in our choices mattering, making him much more helpful than Mr. "I'm already free, losers," and Mr. "God, I wish I was free." But I will say, now it at least feels like the only one ending is less making sure Undertale fans don't expect a bunch of endings, and more of a direct challenge, the main obstacle that we're trying to overcome in this game. Despite that, Chapter 2 is still the only chapter with a significant change in events due to the weird route, but the weird route is still implied to be the proof that our choices matter, even though nothing else has majorly changed yet in what key events happened. Full Pacifist is in the same boat, where Rousey thought this would make a difference, and clearly it's changing some things, but it still hasn't made a major breakaway in the intended course of the game. So maybe both of these will finally pay off near the end of the story. There's actually a lot more to dive into with the weird route. We can pretty safely assume that we've already diverted from the intended path of the game in the only way we can. Chapter 3's sword route heavily implies that the snow grave of Chapter 2 is the breaking point. all we do in Chapter 4 is make sure the game doesn't get back on track, which Chris really seems to be trying to do. They brought Birdley to the hospital, told Noelle it was all a prank, and took the thorn ring off her, hiding it from us. Although Birdley is an interesting case, because his 3 states of being, normal, dead, and the compromise for Birdley haters who do the normal route, haven't changed a ton yet, but the differences might intensify when we get to the festival. He's also still the only bead broken off of the bead toy at the hospital, which seemed like our proof of the weird route changing things, and was something I really thought would continue to be more significant, but there isn't anything more with the bead toy, or at least not the toy itself, because if you're on the weird route in Chapter 4, Chris's title actually changes to Dark Bead, broken off but still locked, which I guess means Chris has broken off from the prophecy but is still locked from freedom because they're under our control or something. I'm not really sure. The end goal of doing the entire weird route at all is still not super clear yet either, outside of just doing it to change the intended path of the game. And the Twisted Sword is still unobtainable, but we now have a clearer idea of when we'll get it. We just have to make sure Noelle keeps the Thorn Ring on, which pretty strongly indicates to me that she's gonna show up in another chapter soon, probably Chapter 5 with the Thorn Ring still equipped, so that we can then use it to make the Twisted Sword. At the same time, Sham tells us they'll make us something good out of all the shadow crystals, which has gotta be the pure crystal. I mean, it still only says purified by the cat, which is vague enough that it could be, I don't know, friend or something, but I think it's safe to say it'll probably be what Sham gives us for getting all the crystals. Which means the Twisted Sword requires us to do both of the main things in the game we associate with freedom from the intended narrative, the weird route and the secret bosses. On the topic of secret bosses, or I guess shadow crystal bosses is more accurate now that one of them is most certainly not a secret. What? What in tarnation is going on here? I mean, clearly they still all have the connection to freedom as a concept. Gerson is all about freedom from the predetermined prophecy, and you could argue the night fight represents freedom in the sense that it's a forced loss fight that you persist through regardless, but like, what about everything else? Do the shadow crystals give them their powers? Not really. Gerson never uses his crystal and he's still strong. So are these guys obsessed with freedom because of the crystals? Nope, not that either. Ram is freedom themed despite not having one. So what does the crystal even do for them? And why is it given to people who already want freedom? Well, let's calm down, take a step back, and break it down. There's still only one shadow crystal per Dark World, even in Chapter 3's highly unusual pattern-breaking Dark World. Each boss still gives you a weapon or armor, it's just the 2 new ones don't give you a choice between one or the other. Chapter 3 technically gives you both, and Chapter 4 only gives you a weapon. Similarly, crystal bosses no longer need to be beatable through both violence or pacifism. To beat the knight, you have to use violence, and to beat Gerson, you have to make him sparkle, I guess. Unfortunately, being objects discarded from their respective Dark World themes just isn't the case anymore. Although you could still make an argument for the broader idea that they're abandoned by society in one way or another. If you look at Ram as Chapter 3's Shadow Crystal boss, who just didn't get the crystal yet because the knight didn't show up on time, he is stated to not fit in with everyone else. You could also argue that Gerson being a dead Lightner makes him somewhat out of place and separate in his Dark World. Or maybe that Gerson's teachings and ideas are being abandoned by Alvin, though Gerson himself is definitely still remembered by people fondly and his stories are so commonplace, so yeah, I don't know, these are both weak enough. I'd argue this potential pattern just isn't there anymore. However, the idea that each Shadow Crystal boss reflects how one might respond to "your choices don't matter" is still on the table. Again, gonna have to go with Ram instead of the Knight for Chapter 3, but he doesn't like the idea of predetermined linearity and seems to just believe that he already has freedom to give Chris. which is a bit of a weaker connection than Spamton and Jevil, but luckily Gerson makes up for this because he clearly has an opinion on the matter, and his response is to ignore the idea of having no choice and act freely regardless. Respecting the idea of predetermined fate at all will only guarantee that you follow it. But we still have some very exciting patterns that have continued with the crystal bosses.
So the story goes, but ain't every story better with a little twist?
What did you do to me, Gerson?
Wow. I'll be honest, I didn't think the idea of each crystal boss cycling through every soul mode from Undertale would be real, but it seems like it is. Ignoring the knights, again, Gerson has the green soul mode. I assume that we're not going to get purple because of Muffet's whole not being a Toby Fox character thing, so the only soul mode left is blue. After that, I guess we do red again. But what I did expect to come back was the freedom leitmotif. Yep, Gerson has it, and as expected of our always the exception, the knight does not. Except thinking about it further, why does the knight break this pattern? Yes, it's always just the exception to what is supposed to be a pattern otherwise, but it still feels like the knight should have this motif that connects all these shadow crystal holders because it is the origin of shadow crystals. Is it maybe that this motif truly is only for those with direct ties to freedom? The fight might represent freedom in some way, but the knight itself has no connection to that concept from what we can tell. But let's not forget the fact that it's largely comprised of Gaster's theme, which may mean that the crystal bosses all have ties to Gaster, and so the knight doesn't? But that would be even weirder because the knight is directly linked to the bunker, one of the most Gastery locations in the whole game. This makes no sense outside of just making sure people wouldn't realize the knight is the crystal boss from the music alone. But on the note of Gaster, his connections to all this just keep getting weaker yet weaker. The freedom motif being Gaster's theme seems like the last bastion of Gaster importance, now that everything just seems to be because of the knight. Except for one admittedly pretty loose connection that mainly comes from my own brain, but hey, it's still going strong, so I have to bring it up. Each crystal boss has a design element from Gaster. Jevil has the eye slits, Spamton has the suit, and now the knight has holes in its hands. God, that's such a big one, because sure, we have no way of knowing if Gaster actually has holes in his hands. We don't know if these are holes, we don't know if these are hands, and we don't even know if this is Gaster, but we're working off the assumption that it is him because that's where all these parallels are coming from. And something these chapters have made very clear is that Toby Fox is fully in tune with what the fans are doing. So I imagine the fact that giving a black and white character deliberate circles on their palms made everyone think of Gaster was expected and intended. If this wasn't supposed to be a Gaster parallel, then Mr. Fox has screwed up almost to the same degree as making a character famous for being purple, not purple in the last game he appears. Though this only matters if Gerson also holds up this pattern, which he does. He has one eye closed and one open. Of course, Gerson has always had this trait, so it's a little hard to argue that this is an intentional connection to Gaster. Obviously, the knight's visual connection seems deliberate, but the others are very circumstantial and easily contestable. And if I'm gonna be honest, the fact that the knight has such a clear Gaster design parallel almost makes me less confident in this, just because of how the knight has almost zero other traits consistent with the other patterns. But the fact that this is one of the few patterns to have stuck around, as well as the fact that each trait these characters have in common with Gaster is different from one another, makes me pretty confident in this. Although I have no idea what traits are left unless we're gonna go with body shape or something, and ultimately all this does is prove that these characters are somehow connected to Gaster, an observation that basically everyone already made. Now, for a few smaller patterns we noticed from chapters 1 and 2, starting with religion. Obviously, we got a lot of religious stuff because of the whole chapter being dedicated to it, and we learned that Hometown's religion worships the same prophecy Ralsei told us about. However, it's unclear why they side with the angel when Ralsei's prophecy painted the angel as an obstacle. Outside of that, I honestly can't think of anything else to note. We all know religion is important here, there's just not much secret lore to point out with something that's so in our face. Next was hugs, symbolizing family, I think. I don't remember what I said in the last video. There wasn't really any solid info we could glean from hugs showing up so often. It was just so weird that there was such a big focus in the first 2 chapters, especially surrounding Rousey. Unfortunately, any former pattern of hugs is gone. Not a single hug nor mention of such occurs in these 2 new chapters. Just kidding, there are hugs. Secret hugs. In Chapter 4, you can hug the fridge in Chris's house, and hug a random wall in the Dark World. Does any of this mean anything? Probably not. Lastly were eyes, and the significance of someone showing their eyes. There isn't much new in these 2 chapters, however there are significant things about eyes that have really been emphasized with these new chapters continuing them. TV World brought back the "Only eyes blinded by darkness can see the way" puzzle from Chapter 1, which was a large part of why eyes seemed significant in the first place. We also have the prophecy saying that titans form from darkened eyes, with the pillar that the titan hatches from being covered in eyes, similar to those from the puzzle. But the titan itself doesn't have any. In fact, none of the main bosses in each chapter have eyes, which is an interesting coincidence at the very least. And of course, there's Spamton's pink and yellow eyes, which have become a lot more noteworthy, but not really in the context of eyes, instead in the context of back to the trash heap with ye. It's not just a Spamton thing anymore. Well, technically it never was, but now the doubters can no longer doubt. People already suspected pink and yellow having significance beyond Spamton because in Queen's basement there was this face labeled "Device Friend" in the code, which honestly I just thought it was some creepy Spamton related thing. I mean, the basement is full of those, but now it's clear that friend here is its own thing. Showing up in Rousey's explanation of Dark Worlds, in the Shadow Mantle boss fight, hidden throughout the Sword Route, and even showing up briefly in the 3rd Sanctuary in Chapter 4. But the very concept of pink and yellow seems to have importance beyond just this face. The odd controller you use during the Sword Route is described as having pink and yellow buttons. There's even a theory that this could be Friend itself, as the most famous knockoff controller brand is Mad Catz. This is a knockoff controller with pink and yellow, Friend is a cat with pink and yellow. It lines up pretty well, but there's unfortunately nothing concrete connecting them. But to me, the main takeaway was that it seemed like this was the knockoff controller Azrael used in the past, creating a potential link there. Outside of that, the shelter key in Chapter 3's Mantle minigame has its name highlighted in pink and then yellow the 2 times it's said in text. Also, more obviously, Lord of the Hammer Chapter 5 has the fields of pink and gold, pretty clearly showing that this is going to be much more significant next chapter. And unfortunately, Asgore has yellow hair and a pink shirt. I don't know how I feel about that. The thing is, I think pink and yellow is very heavily linked with shadow crystals specifically. I was already guessing that all of Lord of the Hammer's chapters were getting progressively more specific to the shadow crystals, so by Chapter 5, that should be entirely about those. But each crystal boss is also tied to pink and yellow. Spamton is obvious, the Shadow Mantle, and therefore the Odd Controller could be considered part of Chapter 3's Shadow Crystal content, and Gerson intentionally has pink hair now, which, combined with the yellow eye and teeth he already had, means he now features pink and yellow prominently in his design. In fact, even Sham, the collector of shadow crystals, is on Azrael's wallpaper, and we just established that Azrael's off-brand controller might be the one with pink and yellow buttons. And if you want to be colorblind for a second, you could even argue that Sham's periwinkle and orange color scheme could be some kind of faded, dirty version of pink and yellow. Of course, that'd be an insane stretch, but Toby Fox seems to stand by this guitar being red, so let's not rule things out quite yet. Nah, I don't actually feel anywhere close to confident with this connection. If I was making a dedicated theory video on this, I'd probably explore the topic with more nuance than this joke diagram of insanity, but I'll leave that to others to explore. And don't even get me started on Susie. But Sham's link to Azrael and his controller with already existing ties to the Shadow Crystals is all interesting enough on its own. Strangely, Jevil only has yellow, no pink, but everything else seems to be suggesting that this is a Shadow Crystal-centric pattern, or at the very least a friend-centric pattern, which just happens to relate to the Shadow Crystals. So I guess we need to wait to find out what friend is, because currently all we know is that friend is a cat. Just like Sham. Nah, I don't think that means anything either. Speaking of Jevil and cats, those both have tails, right? There's a strangely large amount of allusions to tails starting in Chapter 4. Most of these seem to be about some event near the end of the game, specifically with the prophecy that reads, "They'll hear the ring of heaven's call. They'll see the tail of hell take crawl." At first, I thought this was a reference to the fight that we were just about to do at the end of Chapter 4, and you could argue some heavenly calls were happening here, but I have no idea what the tail in this scenario would be. However, it's clearly going to be something bad in the future. There's a philosopher hidden in the same secret egg-adjacent room as that book about tears and glass, and they tell us a jumbled up message. It's random every time, so I can't write it down to read from my script, unfortunately, but the intended order of words seems to be, "Lost where the forest would grow, the children followed the pointed tail." The poor children! And if that wasn't enough of a warning for you, when fighting them as an enemy, they can sometimes say, "the tail which must be followed," and "the tail which must not be followed." Pretty clearly showing that, at the very least, these guys don't think it'd be a good idea to follow the tail, whatever that is. Noelle's story about Chris and co. exploring beyond the forest could relate to them getting lost where the forest would grow, and considering the sword route of Chapter 3 shows us breaking through the trees from hometown to get further into the route, that all seems pretty bad. The most popular current idea is that the tail is referring to friend, because friend is a cat, cats have tails, and more distinctly the tail is depicted as being made of circles, which is important because Noelle's stories in the Spampton sweepstakes constantly talk about the game Cat Pedders, which was a game where the cats were made out of circles. So friend is a cat made of circles, the tail is made of circles, it all lines up. Though that would make so many of these all-important existential prophecy things just basically references to Noelle's childhood specifically, and be a real Homestuck situation at that point with like, it's like you know what, I'm not gonna explain it. But I will say, it's a little concerning that we're being warned about a tail now when the game has spent a long time being weirdly focused on Susie's tail throughout the whole story. Could following the tail be in reference to how we shouldn't follow Susie? I don't know, because the focus on Susie is that she specifically does have a tail, but we don't see it, so the only other tail of any significance is Jevil's. It is weird that Spampton turned out to be so important when Jevil kinda just didn't, so I'd be down with Jevil being more involved. In fact, if we look at the original prophecy panels we started this whole tail thing with, it seems pretty relevant to those two. The tale of a devil and a phone call from heaven honestly makes perfect sense, but doesn't really explain anything. Maybe it means that the item versions of these two will be important for us to have later, but the crystal bosses feel so specifically outside of the prophecy that having any part of them actually be in the prophecy would screw up a lot of our understanding. Besides, Jevil's tail is only one of the two possible items he can give us, and not even nearly the most significant part of him. If Jevil's gonna be important later, it'll be through Sham. Okay, wait, I thought of this way too late, so I'm just shoving this in here right at the end of the tail section. Instead of circles being cat pedders, the circle tail could be an allegory for the beads on the bead toy in the hospital. Therefore, following the tail would be following along our predestined path. the same thing that the bead toy symbolizes. Though something I didn't highlight earlier as much as I probably should have is that the philosophers who say we must not follow the tail also say we should follow the TALE, which you gotta assume means the prophecy. That implies that following the pointed tail is not only separate, but antithetical to following the prophecy, meaning the tail can't really represent the beads, and that not following the prophecy is bad, which we probably could have assumed. But that's enough about the tail stuff. Honestly, it's a little weird to think that there are brand new patterns that are only showing up now, when we already had so many patterns identified in chapters 1 and 2, but that's what we've got here. Nowhere is now being used in reference to the location of the eggs. To be fair, it could just be a mysterious, vague term in line with calling the egg guy the man, but it comes back in chapter 4 when you can choose to go nowhere with Gerson, who says,
I'm sure you'll get there eventually, so what's the rush?
on the normal route, and on the weird route talks about our
Relationship troubles.
even saying,
If things go cold, you might... If things go cold, you might...
God, the Gerson voice is falling apart. Whatever. If things go cold, you might think your whole world is ending, which is some potentially very unsubtle foreshadowing for the weird route, but I'd expect nothing less from Gerson. That might not have any relevance to whatever weird pattern is forming with the concept of nowhere and the eggs, but I honestly have no idea what all this nowhere business could mean, so I might as well bring up whatever I can. At best, it might be forming some group pattern where the eggs require us to say we're a cheater and a liar, going nowhere in life, but like, that's kinda harsh. Similarly, I have no idea what's up with all these roots in my game. The weeds are just gonna regrow if you don't get rid of these. The most obvious instance of this is that dang not egg room in chapter 4 that somehow manages to have 3 entirely separate but equally important things in it that are all unrelated to the actual egg room it connects to. Here it's just a prophecy panel labeled Roots that shows a home, I suppose. However, the song in Queen's Basement, where you fight Spamton Neo, is called Digital Roots, and the dungeons in the Mantle minigame remix that song into Bit Roots. Both of those songs are connected to the Shadow Crystals, but the prophecy panel is connected to the Egg Room, so there's not really a clear consistency here. It just seems important. Although, yes, I'm adding another thing way too late. I noticed that the Roots motif is actually very similar to The Holy, a motif that, for how important it is shockingly not very present in the soundtrack. But the thing is, The Holy is just one flipped note away from being Gaster's theme, and subsequently the Freedom motif as well. You could even argue that the beginning is Gaster's theme flipped upside down, which, like, maybe means this is some sort of anti-Gaster thing or something. It probably just means it's Gaster's theme in a slightly different way. So yeah, in a weird way, Roots is actually The Holy, which is actually Gaster's theme. It always comes back to Gaster. It's almost annoying at this point, to be honest, but I can't say this one doesn't make sense at least. And for a couple of minor things to keep in mind, one of Chris's mystery stats on the power menu was finally revealed to be either a slain or purified stat, depending on if you slayed or purified the Titan spawn things. And it only counts those, which suggests that we'll be fighting a lot more of those things in the future, and how we handle them will be significant later down the road. The other thing is that Susie seems to be really attached to this idea of things never changing. In both the Gerson fight and the end of chapter 4, she talks about wanting things to stay like they have been, which is clearly setting up for something important. Some future clash of ideals or wake-up call for Susie, I'm sure. But with all this new info, well, probably not digested, but at least shoved into our mouths, I think the best way to finally wrap up this more than 2-hour-long video is to shove away all the obtuse speculation, elaborate story themes, and abstract analysis to just focus on the basics of what we know about the next chapters specifically. You gotta start with the hard facts of the case. First of all, we know it's coming out in 2026. Second of all, the festival is going to be a large part of the chapter. I feel like it'll probably happen before any sort of Dark World shenanigans, because this Dark World seems like it'll have a lot of emotional weight that would not gel well with going to the festival soon after, but that hasn't stopped the game before. And those are the only two things we can say for certain. And the festival part isn't even guaranteed, because something could totally happen that completely disrupts the festival before we get to go enjoy it. I mean, 2026 release date isn't guaranteed either, but let's have a little hope in our hearts here. And don't worry, I know there's a lot more that, while not confirmed, is pretty universally accepted. So let's talk about those here too. For example, Chapter 5's Dark World is gonna be in Flower King, with some direct involvement from Asgore, potentially even being the main boss of the chapter. Clues seem to indicate the presence of some sort of fields and some sort of wheat in the Dark World, and it's pretty common to guess that the Inferno of Jealousy will center around Asgore's jealousy over Sans stealing away Vine Mother. But it's entirely possible that the jealousy is from someone other than Asgore. Like, it could be Noelle jealous of Chris on the normal route, or Susie jealous of whatever's going on in the weird route. Neither of those would really be infernos like Asgore could do, but the burning part could just be symbolism and not literal fire. If we want to go deeper into speculation territory, I feel like we might visit Flower King specifically because of whatever date we're going on at the festival. Gotta go get flowers for our Pookie. Sorry. So that means Noelle might join us, as she's going to be on a date with either Susie on the normal route or Chris on the weird route. It also means Birdley could show up again. I have zero confidence in that happening, he does not seem important enough, but it would be pretty funny if the jealousy in Chapter 5 is actually Birdley's. It's also equally unlikely, but would be equally funny, if Asgore's Dark World is somehow just the entirety of Undertale. It makes sense for his own Dark World to position him as the king, and there's even enough elements in the back room of his shop that could equate to the major Undertale locations. Just, you know, you have to force it, and they're not in order, and not all of them are there, but it'd be really funny. Some more ideas are that the flowers in the back of Asgore's shop could parallel the people who are important to him. If they do, they'd probably be relevant in the Dark World, but it's also potentially just symbolism, which I promised I'd stop doing, so how about a crack theory? You love those, right? One of the big theories of the Chapter 2 era was Woody theory, a bunch of crazy evidence that boiled down to the idea of a Shadow Crystal boss that was a cowboy from a cancelled Western show parodying Woody from Toy Story, and somehow, despite being so specific to Chapter 3, the theory can still be revised to work for Chapter 5. If you want a full breakdown, SpookyDood, the original Woody theorist, has made a follow-up about some new evidence, and there's also a separate video by ronbrazy covering the same topic. They're both good, so I recommend them both if you're interested in just listening to insane ideas for fun, but the basic summary is that Chapter 3 deliberately calls out that a cowboy show was Asgore's favorite, and an unused quiz even makes a big deal about that show being cancelled, which would normally not matter since we're no longer in TV land, but Asgore's room still has a TV in it. So let's not focus too much on the past. In fact, while Chapter 5 is exciting, we shouldn't limit ourselves to just that. Why not ask what lies beyond? I don't know. We've already met the knight, we've already fought a titan, the only big thing left would be to actually seal the angel's heaven and meet Gaster. We'll probably go into the Shelter Dark World at some point, maybe Chapter 6. As for Chapter 7, well, that's the thing. What is it? Is it anything at all? With our current pace, it'd be totally reasonable to wrap things up within Chapter 6. Gerson says Chapter 7 of Lord of the Hammer was never written. The Eggman's schedule could debatably include 6, but definitely does not go up to 7. And Sham says that there's only 2 Shadow Crystals after Chapter 3's. We got one in Chapter 4, so that just means there's one left in Chapter 5, and then, what then? For that matter, what's going on with Chapter 6? Gerson implies there was a 6th chapter of Lord of the Hammer, but doesn't tell us what it is. The Eggman's schedule doesn't specify a 6th day, and there's no 6th Shadow Crystal at all. Whatever's going on, clearly Chapter 6 is going to completely abandon whatever semblance of a formula we still have going, and Chapter 7 might not even be real. Maybe 6 will be in the bunker, but we won't get a chance to go back to the light world after that? Or maybe Chapter 6 just won't have a dark world and 7 is the bunker, which might only unlock if we do everything else in the rest of the chapters, like the weird route and the shadow crystals, but there's not much point to guessing all this. If there's one takeaway I got from chapters 3 and 4, it's that there aren't any patterns. There's no formula, there's really no way to know what's gonna happen next. Sure, the next Dark World locations seem clear to us now, which previously would have been a bummer, because the location was most of the mystery. But now, I don't even have a micro concept of what the next Dark World will be like, even with its location basically confirmed for us. I feel like if we had to live for 5 years with just these 4 chapters, it would have been harder than when we had just the first 2. The first 2 chapters painted such a clear picture of a format that we could use as a foundation for speculation. What kind of wacky darkeners might be made out of the mundane objects of each light world location? What crazy, freedom-obsessed, abandoned object would the next secret boss be? What core object of this Dark World's theme could be the main boss? We thought we had this all figured out. I mean, look at chess theory. People swore by this, and now, naught but ruins remain of their kingdom. But that's by no means a bad thing. Going into Chapter 3, I was expecting something like all those fan-made Chapter 3s we've gotten throughout the years, but just the official version. Tifu World had constant references to Chris's tsundere cactus, and I was fully expecting to see them somewhere as a Darkner. Maybe they'd even battle us or something, and Susie would be like, "Bro, this Darkner has a crush on you. I didn't know you were a player." And it would be like, oh my god, she knows about the player. And if we were following the same structure fans expected, it definitely would have happened. But that's not what we got. Chapter 3 serves as the transition point where we realize that the Dark Worlds aren't just fun adventures. There's a reason Ralsei sees these as threats, there's a reason we're tasked with sealing them. But that means none of those fan-made chapters have been invalidated. They haven't been replaced. So the gap is still left for people to continue making the Chapter 2 styled chapters we all thought would happen. Anyone can go turn the 2 fruit punch bowls from church into a duo of quirky Darkners, or make that tsundere cactus Darkner real. Obviously not me, I'm too cool for that, but I'm still glad the wait isn't gonna be that long, though. After Chapter 4, I feel like I've got no ground to stand on for speculation, so you gotta give us something, Tobes. The theories can't satisfy our hunger anymore. This is a beast you have created. Feed it, or perish. So yeah, I'm pretty excited to see what happens in Chapter 5.